Hi, welcome everybody. Welcome to the latest CTO Craft Bytes event. Today we're going to be looking at leading and communicating successfully through change. If this is your first CTO Craft Bytes, let me just tell you a little bit more about the group. CTO Craft is a mentoring and coaching community with technology leaders from all over the world, focusing on supporting technologists and their leadership growth. Community members are currently over 7,000, and CTO Craft provides them with one-to-one coaching, mentoring groups, and a curated Slack community and events just like this one. Huge thanks today to the headline partner AWS for making these events Bytes possible. I'm Emma. I'm going to be hosting for you today, and I am Chief of Staff at 101 Ways, which is a technology consultancy. My specialism is coaching transformation, so this topic is particularly close to my heart. And with that, I'm going to pass over to David and Oscar to introduce themselves.
Yeah, Oscar.
Yeah, hi everybody. Really nice to be here. We are David, Mathew, and Oscar Mathew. I'm Oscar Mathew. This is David Mathew. He's on the same part of the screen.
Oh yeah.
He is for me. We work in a team development and organizational change and transformation space. We're a small consultancy. We're also father and son, which is not weird if you run a scaffolding firm, but if you do OD work, is a bit strange. But get that out in the open straight away. We're really excited to be here to talk to you about this topic. Hello from me, David Mathew.
Yeah, hello from me. I've been in organisational change work internationally and here in the UK forever, really, for 30 years or more. And I've been a visiting professor at 2 different universities for, again, about the same period of time. So I try to bring some kind of evidence-based stuff to what we do, not just kind of the latest fad.
Excellent, thank you. For those of you that are new to this particular platform, over on the right of your screens, you'll see chat windows. By all means, jump in there. A few people have said hello as well. Good to hear your thoughts and chat to each other as you go. Down the bottom as well, you'll see a little button that says ask a question. Now, Oscar and David will take questions all the way through, so just pop a question in there if there's anything that particularly grabs your attention or you want to know more about, and I will feed them in as we're talking through things. Now, today's going to be a little bit different in that they have a few slides, a bit of a presentation to walk through to kind of set the scene around the topic, and then we'll get more into questions and discussion afterwards. But I guess to start with then, so we have 67, 70 or so people registered here are all technology leaders, CTOs. How is this subject, do you think, particularly relevant to CTOs then? What can you tell us that's going to be useful for them?
David Mathew, do you want to have a go at that one?
Thanks. Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, no one needs persuading about the kind of prevalence of change, whether it's huge scale change, like we just actually are helping Public Health England, who you will all have heard of because of what's been going on with COVID. We've been helping all of their senior people translate to their new organizations, massive change, big traumatic change, or whether it's tiny changes in a team. There's good evidence about what helps people to get through that process. Sometimes it's really difficult stuff. Sometimes it's inspiring change. So it comes in all kinds of ways. And just to get it out here, I don't think people resist change. People resist being shafted, but they don't resist change for itself. So that's part of what we're going to get into.
A lot of these concepts that we're going to look at in our little slide presentation are kind of equally applicable to kind of large-scale, huge systemic change. When you've got, like, for example, those at Public Health England being axed and turned into something different. So you've got thousands of people going through a big change program. And the same concepts really apply if you're doing it on a team basis or in a much smaller organization. So I'm hoping from a CTO perspective here that there are some really interesting nuggets that you can take forward if you're leading a team to how to help people navigate a change in circumstance. More on that in a moment, I think.
Cool. Okay, do you want to start showing us your slides then and walk us through it?
Yeah, with no further ado. It'd be quite embarrassing with a tech crowd if I couldn't share slides. So hopefully that's showing there.
Yeah, I can see.
Great. So yeah, this is the subject, and this is what we're going to go through with you all today. So understanding the change journey that people go on when they're going through change, irrespective of what that change is, and particularly around if you're running a team or leading a team, your team's reaction to that change. We're going to look at trust as a particular concept, and there's a particular reason why we're looking at trust. And then we're going to look at how to build a safe and constructive team culture, like an ecosystem or bubble for people to go through change, and how you want to do that from a CTO or leadership perspective. But in my hunt for inspiring imagery to kind of frame this, I settled on this image with a person atop a mountain. And the reason that we use this at the outset of the session is it quite nicely encapsulates what it's like, we think, to be in a senior or leadership position when you're going through change. Because if you look at it from the perspective of the person on top of that mountain, there are some bits that can be made out. So you've got some of the mountains in the distance, but a lot of what is coming down the line is covered in cloud. You can't see it, and it's pretty unclear what the next steps are going to be for that person who's on top of the mountain. And it's impossible to disentangle this topic from the pandemic, because for most, if not all businesses, there is a degree of kind of knowing what's coming down the line, but a lot that is not sure. So lots of this topic is about finding a way of dealing with the pronounced uncertainty that most of us find ourselves in one way or the other. There's a difference, though, between change and transition. David, did you want to talk to this one?
Yeah, let me get into that. One of the key things to, I think, understand and work with when you're trying to make change successfully is to understand the difference between the practical external project management side of what needs to be done, what roles need to be changed, what do people need to be doing differently, where's the information coming from. That's, if you like, the project management, and is often called a change management program. But alongside that, but distinct from it, there are the individual journeys that people will be going through. And in any team, people will be going through their own particular kinds of journeys, and they may be very different for different people. But paying some attention to what those individual journeys are is important. So Bridges, who's a guy who's worked in organizational development and change for a long time, has this nice quote about the first task of change being about the project management side, but the first task of transition management, which is what he calls the individual journeys, is to convince people to leave home. And again, if any of you are familiar with the literature, which I'm sure some of you are, one of the big cheeses in this area is a guy called John Cotter, and he says, in this situation, you cannot appeal to people with data and facts and strategy alone. You've got to account for how people feel. And a good model for this is the model that Bridges gave us, which starts with very simple, quite generic. Any change starts with an ending, something that's being put to one side, a transition through some work to get to the new place, and a new beginning. So that was it. It's simple, but it's very powerful because it shows different stages that people will need to go through on their journeys. So if you can put the emotional tone up on that, Oscar, we've added to their model some of the emotions that people might be expected to go through in your team as they go through even a relatively simple change from the left-hand side of the screen to the right-hand side of the screen. So if change is initiated by you, you can expect by the team itself, you can expect excitement, anticipation. They're all very positive drivers through that change process. However, if it's being done to you, either by the environment, by a big organization that you're a part of, then you can have different emotions about what that change involves. And certainly in big done to changes, you are going to break up, you are going into a new organization. You must inevitably, in any team, you will get uncertainty. Will I have a job? Apprehension, what's my role going to be? Am I going to be doing the same kind of work? And am I going to be working with the same people? All of those emotions. As you go through the transition, it becomes more of, why are we having to do this unnecessary work? We're having to run the business as usual, as well as making the transition happen. This is all very complex, very stressful. There's a lot too much work here. Those are typical emotions in the transition. And hopefully you then get to the right-hand side with a new beginning where people say, well, we've accomplished something here. This is exciting. We can see a new and better way of doing things. So that's the model that we'll be thinking about a bit in the next 15, 20 minutes. But Oscar, do you want to talk to what the research says about when we know people support change?
Yeah, and I think this is really interesting because there is some pretty good research. There's been some pretty good research done and now evidence behind what people need to have in place for change to go well. And if you've been involved in, if you work in a large organization, if you've been involved in a large organizational change or a change within your own business, these are the kind of things that we know people need to have. So that the people are convinced for the need of the change to happen in the first place often isn't there, and that the solution offered is the one that fits the bill. That for them, for individuals, the personal benefits of this happening at all outweigh the costs, that people are involved and the culture around them is supportive. Really importantly, that there's a celebration of what's happened before, that too often with change, it's shrouded in some kind of shame or this hasn't worked at all, we need to move on. Whereas it's really important to celebrate the good about what you're leaving behind. But we know from the research, and this is why we're going to kind of talk to this particular topic, trust is essential in a successful change process. So they need to trust you as a leader, and they trust all the other leaders around them and the organization at large. And the reason for this, you may have come across this model before. It's taken from a really accessible book on team dynamics called The 5 Dysfunctions of the Team by Patrick Lencioni. And he says, in essence, that in order for any team to function well, and you can extrapolate this out to organizations, you need to have 5 different layers at work, and it's incremental. You build them from top to bottom. The most important thing that you need to have within a team or within an organization is a sense of trust, a sense of inclusion, and a sense of psychological safety. And trust is a really interesting concept because it's not something you can just go down to HR and say, I'm having a problem, there's no trust in my team, can you come and do something about it, please? It's quite an amorphous topic. There's a really interesting, many of you will probably know Brené Brown, a social scientist. She's done a really interesting TED talk called The Power of Vulnerability. It's also a book. She talks a lot about the relationship between trust and vulnerability. And she has this idea that trust is built in small moments, it's incremental, and it's made real by action. So it's about what you do and what you say. And she says, well, she gives this very nice example in her TED talk about a marble jar that sits on the front desk of her daughter's elementary school. And when one of the kids in the class does something that causes another of them to feel good, feel positive, and feel included, they put a marble in the marble jar. And when they do something that makes them feel excluded or put aside, they take a marble out of the marble jar. So you get this idea that you have this incremental rising and falling of trust within groups visible on the desk at the front of the classroom. So when thinking about, in your role as CTOs or senior people within organizations, these are the kind of things that you need to think through if you want to build that trust both within your team and with those people around your team. The first of those is credibility. If you remember from the slide before, trust is all about behavior. It's what you do and how you're seen to behave. So can other people tell by my behavior that I have their best interests at heart? The next two are really indicated in the literature on this: reliability and consistency. Am I doing what I say I'm going to do for people? And do people know what they're going to get when they deal with me? Am I reliable and consistent? Vault is a bit different. That's one of Brené Brown's. It's a question about how well you hold information and experiences that are shared with you that are not yours to share outside of that confidence. It's a really important one. The next two are kind of linked: integrity and courage. Are you standing up for your values? Are you choosing right over what's easy? But the last one here is particularly important when you're going through change, and that is cohesion. Do you and the rest of your team feel like you're on the journey together, wherever it is that you're going? Are you walking with them in lockstep? And do they feel like you're one of the pack, if you like? So that's from Stephen Covey and Brené Brown. But some things to get us to start thinking about trust and what it means to behave in a trusting manner with those around us in our team. Onto the concept of psychological safety, which David Mathew is going to tangle with, I think.
Yes, so this is another key idea, I think, in handling and running with change. And it links actually to the question that was asked about constant change in the chat. The team dynamics is really important in helping a team through change, obviously. And this is much more complex than is sometimes allowed for. So there was a really big piece of research at Google where they found that this concept of psychological safety was the most instructive concept in understanding how which teams were not only most successful, but also most professionally fulfilling for people in the teams. The very concept of psychological safety was the most important concept in understanding the effectiveness of those teams. And psychological safety, it's a bit of a jargon word, but the psychological safety in a team is not just a sense of support and we're in this together. It's also a sense of I can actually raise difficult questions if I need to. I can raise concerns if I need to. I can mention it if I think we're going down the wrong path. these things are not, in my experience, and I've worked a lot with teams in lots of different businesses, are not at all taken for granted. You had an example recently, that the report that came out, for example, on the UK's COVID track record over the last year. One of the big things that was criticised was something called groupthink, where the scientists and some of the other groups could not really question each other in any significant way about what was being done. It felt like the UK is exceptionally good. We don't really have to listen to other people, and we know what we're talking about. It shuts down any kind of conversation that's absolutely essential if you want to make things happen successfully. So here's the idea. Psychological safety is an interpersonal climate where people are able to express ideas, ask questions, that's okay so far, quickly acknowledge mistakes, and also raise concerns. It starts, can you shift to the next slide, Oscar, please? It starts this team dynamics on the left-hand side of this diagram, which is you build some kind of supportive team. Now, of course, we've all come across teams where they're not supportive, where there's a lot of conflict, and that's a whole thing to handle in itself. But oftentimes, you do get a basic level of support. Yeah, we get on well together, we can chat to each other, we go out and have a beer together, all of that kind of stuff. But even at this level, there are issues before we get to the tricky stuff on the right-hand side, which is we talk about everything we need to in a constructive way that helps us to move forward. So could you move to the next slide, please, Oscar? Even at a basic level in teams, I've very rarely seen teams without some of these issues. Number one, unequal voices. It may be appropriate for some people to talk more than others, almost certainly is, but it's when that gets stuck into a pattern that you start to have problems. The issue that I see most often that causes this was what I call first and loudest, which is an issue is put into a team for discussion, and it's always Joe and Sue who start first. They may be extrovert, they may not like silence, but they jump in first. And that can have it can be really helpful because it takes the team, it energizes a group, but it's also got implications about shutting other people up. So people do what's called social loafing in teams, and it's a well-researched phenomenon that some people say, oh, well, Joe and Susie do the talking, I tend to sit back. That's fine, that's the way this team works. Well, it may be okay, but it might not be. And one of the things that is essential to kind of be able to discuss is, are there some people in this team who are over-contributing? They might be doing it with the best will in the world. They might not. They might be the hippo in the group, highest paid person who expects their opinion to be listened to most. And in groups, there is, again, a well-known phenomenon that people defer to power. We defer to power far too easily for the good of the group, actually for our own good quite often, but for the good of the group. So there are all these dynamics that can set up in teams that need to be carefully but openly discussed and moved through. And that's at the basic end. So if you move to the next one, what can you do to get things improved in that respect? You can, if you're team leader, make sure that people are listened to without interruption. You might want to go round a group sometimes. I don't know if you do that already, one by one, to make sure everybody gets their views in, even the most junior people. You want to make sure the same voices don't dominate. Often that's best done offline. If you feel one person is dominating too much, even if it's just in terms of airtime, you might have a word with them. What you want to get into the group for the best results is divert, and by this I mean a range of voices to feel that everybody can feel included and heard. So, and on top of that, obviously the speaking and listening need to be constructive and respectful. And listening actually is a skill. It's not just a matter of the sound waves going in, and it's not just a matter of you hearing. If you're a good team leader, you can also make sure that people feel heard. Those are three separate stages. Hearing it, kind of going in, you knowing that you've heard it, but also you convincing other people that you have heard. And often this is done by repeating to someone what they've said. Oh, so you're saying ... It helps people to feel as if they have been heard. Okay, on to the more complicated end. Talking about the difficult stuff at the other end is a whole other ballgame, because as teams, it's very easy and almost a natural tendency to get into the denial that there is a difference between us. Oh yeah, sure, that's okay. No one's in disagreement here. There are even phrases you'll hear people use, like, I think we're all on the same page here. I think we're all agreeing really, when you're not. So there's a sense of groupthink, and alongside that comes undiscussability of key issues. That's quite difficult, really, to get into. And you need to be a pretty good team leader to be able to have a supportive team that can also make sure that you could acknowledge mistakes people have made, you resolve them, and you make sure that there's as much constructive disagreement as you can possibly have, because that's what improves final decision making. So here's what you can do, just to sum that up. You need to encourage a mutual expectation in your team that people will actually discuss different viewpoints without being critical of individuals. We don't criticize individuals in this team. We talk about a lot of different views. You kind of keep an eye out for whether you think people are raising concerns that they want to. And again, these might be concerns about work levels. They might even be mental health issues about what's happening because the team is pressurizing us. All of those issues you want to be able to have raised in the appropriate forum. Sometimes it's the team, sometimes it's one-to-one with you as a leader. And you want to make sure that any questions are asked and answered and information is shared. And I'm raising these, they might seem like no-brainers, but there's very good research showing that if all information is not shared unless you really try to pull it out of a team. I think that's the 2 points I wanted to raise there, Oscar. Thank you.
Next thing to think about is, how do you do this in really uncertain times? Because you've probably got a bunch of questions as well. I mean, how do you lead a team through a pandemic, for example? So there was some really interesting work done by a Harvard professor called Amy Edmondson, who incidentally also wrote all the stuff on psychological safety. And at the beginning of the pandemic, she said, when faced with this level of uncertainty, the number one task for someone who is leading a team is transparency, which is explaining to the team, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, and here's what we're going to do to try and close that gap. So transparency as a concept is really, really useful. And the reason for this may be quite obvious. You probably recognize this image if you're into space. This is the Perseverance lander module landing. And the reason that I chose this picture is because as a CTO, as a leader, as someone who's senior, you're going to be leading people in your organization on a journey. And there's going to be an awful lot of uncertainty about where you're going, how you're going to get there, whether all of you are going to get there at all. And that requires an awful lot of you as an individual. Because to some degree, at least, if you have been in a senior position leading people in the last 18 months, you have been leading into the unknown. And people will be looking to you for answers that you might not have. So how do you deal with it? And what Amy Edmondson said is transparency is essentially how you deal with it, which is all about keeping people around you connected to the bigger picture. If you remember back to our person on top of the mountain, you have a particular vantage point in your organization, especially if you're a CTO. You will have a view of the landscape that is, I imagine, unlike anybody else's. And this is all about whether or not you're sharing that fully with those around you. And she said transparency links to a couple of other things. Consistency, which is keeping your promises and acting fairly. It's also in the trust material. Responsibility. Are you talking about the hard stuff? Are you being honest with people? And are you doing your best not to avoid difficult topics? She talked about this particularly around sugarcoating. It's a very natural human tendency to not want to make people feel exposed or to not deliver the hard messages. But what happens if you sugarcoat is that the sugarcoating wears off and you at best get seen as out of touch and at worst as disingenuous. So she said it's really important to not do that. Being humble with it, having the humility to be upfront with people about what you don't know. Leaders, especially senior leaders, we find when we work with them, are often hesitant to share the fact that they don't know the answer to something in uncertainty, but there's a real power in saying to people, I don't know the answer, but come with me on the journey and we'll find out. And lastly, it's a little bit of a tone change, is inspiration. Because Amy Edmondson's full quote was, transparency is all about explaining to your team, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, and this is what we're going to do to close that gap. But coming second, quickly behind that, is finding a way of articulating a sense of possibility and hope with people, of walking with them and lifting them up and taking them with you on the journey. So with transparency, this is something that you can do now while we're talking about it, a personal reflection. How well do you feel you do this? How well do you share with people what you know, your vantage point? And are you good at sharing what you can? Equally important, perhaps even more important is, are you good at sketching out for people the bits you can't see? What don't you know? Are you communicating that to people? It's often a blind spot for leaders that they don't tell people what they don't know, and so people assume they know things that they don't, and they're just not telling them. People are going to know. Sorry, people are going to want to know what you think about what's going on, especially in turbulence and uncertainty, and what you personally are being challenged by. It's a brilliant thing to be able to do as a leader, is to say to people, "This is hard. I'm finding this tough. I'm personally challenged by this, but one of the things we can do together is try and figure this out." And have you thought through what you need to do to help the team and how they can help you? Have you had that conversation? So that's Transparency, Amy Edmondson. She's really good, and we can give you some stuff on that, I think, in the Slack channel, if you'd like to. Back to the Bridges model, and this is all about how to have those conversations with your team, which are not always easy.
Yeah, we're going to spend the last few minutes now on having conversations within your team. So if you were here at the start, you'll have seen this model, and I've kind of summarized it a bit here. From the ending stage, you have people who might be saying, I need more information before I can get going on this. I actually don't support this change at all. Up through the transition zone, where you start to say, okay, I've understood that now. I understand what you're trying to do with this. What do we have to do? Up through, I see some exciting possibilities. And finally, the final stage of the journey, it's going, well, how can I build on this? How can I help? So that's the journey and people will be on different points on that at different times, because change is usually multifaceted. It has things going on, different streams going on, if you like. Different people in your team will have different views at different times as well, because of their personal circumstances and what's in it for them. So the trick for the team leader is, you can do the next slide, is how you can manage to cover all the bases on that spectrum, inspiring people who are already on the journey, as well as relating to people's concerns if they haven't left home on the bottom left of that journey yet. Fortunately, we have good research about how to have effective change conversations. I'm not going to go into these in great detail, but it's easy to understand. Number one, what is not effective is just telling people to do something because it's their job. It puts people's backs up. You might get some performance out of them, but you won't get motivated performance, which is what you're after. Alongside that, what you definitely don't want to do is to micromanage people through change, or implicitly threaten people, like, if you don't do this, we might be looking for somebody else to do it who can do it in your place. All of that, fairly obvious, is not helpful to having effective change conversations. What is good? Here's what the research shows quite clearly helps. Firstly, listening respectfully. And as I said, listening respectfully is not a no-brainer. It's not. I would ask people, how well do they think you listen? Because it's easy for me to think I listen well, and people say, well, actually, don't always. Secondly, fortunately for all of us, rational discussion is very important. Clarifying facts and logic to keep people engaged really helps. Consulting people and asking for their views. This is the trickiest thing for people at the top of organizations, who tend to take on a lot of responsibility for them into their own kind of, as if they are solely responsible, and team leaders can do this too. Whereas actually, again, there's research that says the more you throw out that ask people to help, you bring their views in, the more likely the change will be successful. And as you go up that arrow, if you like, through the transition zone into the new world, you ask people to get engaged more and more by helping you to collaborate on change tasks, leading tasks themselves. And you inspire people by talking about small gains have been made on the way, how worthwhile the overall big picture is. So that's the inspiration stuff. So this slide is the one of the things you do want to do if you want to make change happen well. How does that translate to you? You need to meet people where they are. So that on the left-hand side of that slide, you'll see, again, that arrow from the top saying, I don't support change, I need more information. Okay, what do we have to do? Down to it's going well. There are different things you might need to be doing with different people in your team at different points on that arrow. So if they don't support the change, what you need to do is listen and respond to their concerns. Honor their past, and particularly their contributions, which might be quite different. The thing they're most proud of might be something quite different from what the team as a whole is most proud of, or what you're most proud of. Their concerns might be concerns you can't relate to at all, but they are their concerns. So there's good listening at that point. As you go through this list, you need to make sure you are well networked, that you've got information to tell people about what's happening and why, particularly setting islands of stability by saying what's not going to change and what is going to change. And more as you go down that list, bringing people in empowering them, involving them, delegating stuff to them, and publicizing successes. So that's almost a checklist for you to go through to say, how well do I do this? Do I really know what's happening? Am I able to feed that into the team? Am I reaching out to others in the organization well enough to know that stuff? Am I listening to the individuals? So that's a checklist for you to go through, and people will be at different points on that spectrum. And there's one more way in which you need to kind of nuance your communications, which I think Oscar's going to talk about now.
Yeah, it's the last thing we're going to kind of put before you is about how you can tailor your communications and why it's a good idea. Please do ask questions, by the way, in the chat. We're going to have about 25 minutes, I think, for discussion around this. So I'd be so interested to know how you see this relating to your world, to your work, and any questions that you'd like to ask of us. So the last topic here is about how you can tailor your particular tailor your communication style based upon your own preferences and those around you. So this is based upon we look at this through the lens of Myers-Briggs communication styles, but you don't need to know about Myers-Briggs or even like Myers-Briggs for this to be beneficial. It's just a way of us thinking about our own innate preferences when it comes to communication. So the first way of preference communication is called ST, which are people who like practical, matter-of-fact material and like to communicate and be communicated by using detailed facts. What's real? What's rational? You have SFs who tend to be interested in the detail, but mostly the detail about how changes impact people. So they're interested in people and detail rather than detail and facts. You also get people who have an NT preference, who are interested in strategy, who tend to communicate by emphasizing big strategic possibilities, and they like that stuff. They like the strategy side of things. And finally, NFs, who are people who are most drawn towards creative emotional possibilities. And those all can be summarized in really simple terms by people who like the practical details, ST, the strategy, NT, the human stories, SF, and the dream, NF. And there are also some interesting gender splits within these different camps according to Myers-Briggs. So 42% of men are primarily drawn towards ST at the top left, only 18% of women, and only 6% of women apparently in the NT camp, whereas 56% of women apparently in the SF camp. So there's interesting stuff there. What you do with this is, if you can identify where you think you are primarily drawn towards, what you want to do is look diametrically opposite that place. So if you look at ST and think, yeah, that's kind of where I get drawn, look at NF, because that, according to the research, is where you're least likely to be paying attention. And what you want to be doing as in your CTO role or as a senior person with a team is making sure that when you communicate, you don't just give people what you would like in the way that you'd like it, but try and spread your communication in a way that appeals to everybody in these four corners. And that's done really by listening to your team and asking them, is this communication working for you? Do you like how you get it? Are we talking about the right stuff? It's about having a dialogue around that. So we've just covered in a very whistle-stop tour these topics. So the change journey, the bridges model, trust, a safe and constructive team culture, undiscussability, transparency, and finally matching your message to your audience and communication styles. So we've covered quite a range of territory there, but we wanted to give you a kind of series of amuse-bouche from the change world to see what sparks your attention, what grabs you, and where you see the relevance. On that note, I'll take sharing.
Cool. That's really interesting. We do have a few questions that have come in already. I guess if I start with the last one that's been asked, which is, are the slides able to be shared? So we hadn't talked about that before. I think it's worth saying that the recording of this is available to everyone that's registered afterwards, so you can go back and have another look as well. But I'm sure we're trying to get Oscar and David onto the CTO Craft Slack channel too, so I'm sure they're happy to share some stuff through that too. Yeah.
Absolutely. I was hoping that would be the one question I'd have to answer so that you can handle the others. Yeah, the slides will be shared.
Excellent. So if I just start then with, so the first one here is quite interesting, and I guess it's from a slightly different angle. So word for word, it's Mark that's asked it. Many senior leaders are aware of and attempt to practice humble leadership with trust, etc., but are restricted by closed mindsets of CEOs, founders, investors, etc., who are only focused on traditionals or sometimes autocratic practices. What tools or techniques can you help to open their minds? So really, I take this as a question of less about leading your team and the people that you are the leader of, but more about managing and your peers and managing upwards even in the organization. So how do you bring people on the journey when you're not actually the one that's leading them, but you're a peer or there are your senior even?
Shall I have a go with that? It's a amazingly good question, an amazingly tricky question to start off with. I think there's not a kind of one size fits all answer to this, but there is a process that I would go through with people, which in the jargon, and you probably would have heard this term, is called stakeholder management, which means to actually regard those people that you've mentioned, either your CEO or the founders or whoever, as stakeholders who have a vested interest in the work of your team. And then I think the best thing to do is to say, what do I understand about these people's interests? And to go through that quite carefully, because it's quite easy sometimes to stereotype people into positions that they may not actually have. It's quite often, for example, to project all kinds of motivations and intentions onto the top of an organization which aren't actually there. But I would break those people into different groups. So the CEO, maybe founders as a group, or maybe 2 or 3 groups of founders or investors, and have a serious discussion with your team and with anybody else who could help you about what their interests actually are. And then what I would do then with a group is to try and put them into different sections so that you can deal with different stakeholders one by one, if you like. And the tricky thing is to stop yourself regarding somebody who really wants stuff from you that you are not comfortable with. The tricky thing is to not regard them as an enemy in some kind of way, and to try and understand how you can turn them into what's called an opponent rather than an enemy, someone who you can trust, who they will trust you, and you can have negotiated conversations with them about the dilemmas that you are facing between what they want and what you can actually provide. Once they get into a position where there's a lack of trust between you as well, that turns it into a whole different kind of ball game. So the tool and technique that I would use is something called stakeholder management, and I'm very happy to have a particular discussion with you, Mark, about what that might look like. But it actually involves diagrams quite a lot about who's in this group, what are their interests, and really thinking carefully about that, and how many of these can we pick off one by one to satisfy them and make sure the trust relationship still stays between us.
I guess some of that stuff's not that much different because there are going to be people, even in the team that you're leading, that aren't up for the journey and are feeling quite anxious about it, or have a different way that they want to approach it, or don't see the value in it as well. So I guess probably a lot of those techniques aren't that different to whether you're leading or whether you're leading or managing a peer or managing upwards. I
think you're absolutely right. I think there is a whole thing about managing upwards that is slightly different, but as you say, it's for all of them, there's a matter of understanding actually what is motivating and concerning the people on the other end of your conversation, if you like. So there's that much certainly in common. Yeah.
Emma, I'll just throw a slightly different answer to that question out, which might just be an interesting alternative, which is more a kind of human dynamics answers, like how do you actually engage people when you're trying to do that? If people are interested in influence or strategic influence, you might well know the concept of push and pull, which is a very well-known influence idea. They know that with pull tactics, which is kind of bringing people with you, that there are 2 particularly effective ways of doing that with people that are similar but slightly different. One of them is partnership. So going to people and saying, let's talk about our strategic objectives here, what we're trying to get out of this, and can we find a way of doing this in a way that serves both of us, that can really make this work. Another approach of it is called consultation, which is kind of almost putting yourself in the position of requiring assistance and saying, can you help me understand this from your viewpoint? I'm in an information gathering stage, can you help me understand this? And it's a really effective, tactic if it needs to be, or technique to get people feeling invested and feeling like they're being put at the center point of that conversation. So I don't know if that's helpful as well, just a different kind of answer to the same question.
No, it's interesting. Thank you. Okay, one of the others that's here, I guess, is again from a slightly different angle. This is from, I can't see the user's name. Oh well. How do you go about understanding new teams brought into your org? So we're talking about change and transition. So what if that change is via an acquisition or a merger, and you start to build trust and taking them through that transition zone when these are people you don't know, perhaps?
Another really good and difficult question. I think
people are good at that, aren't they?
They are.
Yeah, keep them coming.
I think it depends a bit on the size of this, on the size of the transition. So I worked with a well-known sports retailer who had a merger with another brand, and despite their best effort, these are two huge organizations. Despite their best efforts, you had to agree with, in a sense, by the end of it, despite their best efforts, that actually there's no such thing as a merger. There are only takeovers, because when organizations are very big, it's very difficult to get such a dynamic of jointness unless there are clear rationale, or there were even in this case clear rationales for it happening, because one side often feels the junior partner. And I think that trying to do everything you can to not make them feel like the junior partner is really, really helpful. But often they're the junior partner because they're not so successful at the moment, and that's why they're being taken over. So your way is often, as a bigger partner, is the right one. So the bigger it is, the harder it is to start with, I think. And I think there's a lot to be said if it's one team and another team, two teams coming together in doing ordinary team building stuff does work. Like having off-sites with people, getting to know each other. And a lot of the things that work best are having a really good structure for an off-site with two different teams, so that people are contained by from having anxiety by the structure of the agenda. But actually the agenda doesn't matter a bit. It's all about the coffee breaks, the networking. It's all about that stuff. You just got to give people some kind of a framework, a fabric to hang those kind of discussions on. So I do think that actually team building, without too much didactic, we are doing this and this is the way it's going to happen, bringing together of people is a really good place to start. You've got to start from that, which is the trust stuff that Oscar was talking about.
Let me just add to that. I wonder if everyone, do you remember what it was like when you had your first day at school? Do you remember that experience? Because that's actually what it's like for people a lot of the time. It's funny because I'm doing a lot of work with groups, the leaders of the PhD who are moving into different areas, and almost every single group is saying to me, it feels like the first day of school again. And so anything that you can do when you're greeting people to make them feel like you would have wanted to have felt. So it's all about inclusivity, bringing people in, making them feel listened to, heard, acknowledged. That's the thing that will really help people bed in. And that's the first thing I think from a leadership perspective you need to do.
I'm just reminded, chuck in there as far as war stories goes, of a client I was working with a little while back, where one of the challenges was how to integrate those teams after it was 5 different companies that had come together. And you talk to them and they still refer to themselves and each other as the company that they were before they became one company. And once I start digging, I realized that it was 15 years ago. And they're still talking about themselves from where they were 15 years ago, rather than the company that they are today. So,
yeah, when you get into the big organization stuff, there's a whole other area that we didn't include that comes into play, which is called, in the jargon, systems theory. And it goes a bit like this. If you're not careful, what will happen is there are people at the top of the organization, people in the middle, and people at the bottom, crudely speaking. The people at the top will take all the responsibility and get increasingly isolated. The people at the bottom will say, well, we're just waiting to be told what to do. And they seem to be pretty hopeless at that. And they sit back kind of disempowered and disenfranchised. And the people in the middle, which is most people, are either having to take sides or frantically thinking, how on earth can we improve the situation? But it can be improved, because if it goes, and it needs something from the top. And what it needs from the top is to say, we cannot handle this ourselves. We are responsible for it. We're not trying to duck that, but we have to engage with people at all levels through this organization who will know how things work. And as soon as they do that kind of reaching out for information, for experience and all of that, the whole dynamic shifts. And people at the bottom start to think, oh, they're asking us what we can do. This is more interesting than it sounds. And they start to get more engaged. And people in the middle then start to see their role, rather than as being split between fighting for one or the other, as being integrators, and that their job is actually to keep this information flowing so that this positive dynamic can keep going. But that's a whole different thing with big organizational change.
Do you think there are people that can't change?
Yeah, I think that, yes. I think there are people who find it very difficult in life. Yeah.
I do quite a lot of work in conflict resolution, and especially conflict resolution work in teams, and that is, I think, that's team development in hard mode. And you do. I remember coming across one situation where normally you can see your way up the rock face, you can see where the handholds are going to be, and I remember it feeling very much like there was just a sheer kind of stainless steel kind of obelisk in front of me. I just could not see a way up. And I think, especially if I'm thinking about the very senior teams that I work with, or people have security of tenure, so they're consultant doctors or senior academics, there's no lever or investment to get them moving. And so when you've got someone behaving in the way that they want to, that serves their needs, and if they've done it without any kind of check or balance for 15 years, where does that motivation come from? And I think in those situations, it's very difficult to encourage people to behave differently.
I'm really interested in one of the things I thought that was really powerful in your slides when you were talking is about that, almost having the bravery or to be able to stand there in front of the team that you're leading through this change and say, I don't know, I don't know where we're going, I don't know what the answer is going to be, but we'll go there together. I guess there's also a case where maybe you don't know, but maybe you don't believe in it yourself. So we have cases where where change is being pushed down from above, perhaps, and you may not be entirely bought into it, but you still have to lead it and you still have to represent it and bring people with you on that. You must have seen that. How do people handle that? What happens?
It's the main question. It's an absolutely core question that we've been grappling with recently, and it's really hard. How do you pick people up with you and lead them with you to the new tomorrow when you're just not convinced of the need to do that in the first place? And also the weight that puts on you. I mean, as an individual, to have to carry that, you have to carry your own anxieties and concerns, and everybody else's in the team too. And it's called the unassailable leader, that you have to act like that's all fine too, but it's the weight that you're carrying. It's a really, really excellent question. David, Mathew, shed some light.
Oh, well, actually, I've moved on to some of the interesting questions in the chat here. Is that all right?
Yeah.
So I want to come on to this one about team trauma, which is interesting. And then I want to go back to opponents versus enemies. Is there such a term as team trauma when leading and communicating is not done in a safe environment? Well, and I'm just wondering, when teams talk about past issues, is it because they're not able to let go? Such a lot here. Sometimes complaining and not moving forward is a way of just being obstructive. Sometimes cynicism is a way of being obstructive, but usually it's because there's something that needs to be talked through. So cynicism can destroy teams, especially in change management. We've been through change before. We did it last year. We had to do it 6 months ago. All of that stuff didn't work then, not going to work now. And they often get a quick laugh out of it. But actually, often the cynic in a team is really helpful because you can go to them and find out just what they think isn't going to work. But at some point, because it is such a destructive emotion, or can be such a destructive emotion, at some point you have to turn those people from cynics to advocates. And that's done by listening to them, because they've usually got a good ground for being cynical about stuff, but only to a certain point. At some point, you've got to say, we are now moving on. So you're either with the program or you're not. But it's got to be done on the basis of, I've given them a really good listening to. And yes, things can hang around. I worked with a team once, actually, where the opponents versus enemies thing was really useful. That was still festering. It was in an obstetrics department. It was still festering 10 years after a big dispute between midwives and consultants. And that was and none of the people were the same people. And that's another thing about groups. Cultures can happen even though everybody in the team has changed, which is a really interesting thing. So yes, it can happen. And at some point you've got to listen. You've got to not just say, oh, shut up. You've got to listen and hear them out, preferably one-to-one, but then you've got to kind of move on. The thing about stakeholder opponents versus enemies, and actually one of the things that resolved that obstetrics issue, was there was one consultant who was being particularly difficult. And I was working with a clinical director and we were trying to work this through. And she worked out that this other consultant was actually an enemy. That is, they did not want to go to the same place in terms of strategy. They didn't even trust them. They would leak minutes, all of that kind of stuff. Now, at that point, one thing happens. They take all your emotional time. As a team leader, you can never forget them, because you're always thinking, how did that happen? All of that stuff. But when you put them in the enemy box, and you do this very reluctantly, I would say 1 or 2 times in a career, not kind of every few months, you say, I have to make sure I get around this person. So you start not inviting them to things, not telling them when meetings are happening, not sending them minutes, all stuff that's very unpleasant organizational politics. But being an enemy is different from being an opponent, who's someone who has different views genuinely, but you trust them. So there is something, and again, I'm happy to talk about whoever wants to talk about opponents and enemies, because it's not something to be done lightly. But in that particular case, the clinical director realized this person was an enemy and started doing different things. So
is that kind of the difference then? About, I guess, trust as an enemy.
Trust is the different. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Okay.
If there's a common thread that I see in the organisations that I work with, it's a reluctance to properly performance manage difficult situations.
Right.
And often when I come into it, it's because I'm someone who can come in and try and help, because they are very reasonably afraid of tangling with those really, really often very senior big people who are causing disruption in a team. So people aren't often bold enough, I think, in dealing with this stuff early on.
Okay.
Should we go to the negativity? Go on, sorry, yes.
No, I was just going to say, we've only got about 5 minutes. So if anybody else has a quick question, then throw it in quick. But yes, go ahead, David.
I'm looking at the chat actually and saying negativity breeds further negativity. Absolutely. And I think it's interesting what you do about that, whether you have a word with someone if there's a focus for that negativity. Thanks, Mark. There's something in the chat Mark just put that I think about the opponents, and once he was fired. Yeah, I was going to say if we had a one-to-one conversation, I was going to say that this is a high-risk strategy. Don't ever use it with someone you work for. Don't make them into an enemy. But in terms of negativity, yeah, you've got to try and reduce that. Normally, it means by talking it through. I think there are lots of reasons why teams become toxic. But if it's one person and it's worth isolating them, I think having tried everything else, because it's difficult.
So yeah, we've only got about 5 minutes left as well. Top tips, I guess. So a couple of people are asking about the Slack channel. That is the CTO Craft Slack community. Let me see if I can grab you a link just while we're wrapping up, but I'm going to post a few links with contact details for everybody anyway, including the CTO Craft conference that's coming up next month. In the meantime, I'll get you a quick link for joining the CTO Craft community as well on Slack. So yeah, while I'm just finding those links, any top tips for people then? There's bound to be lots of people that are in the middle of change or just about to embark on it and trying to figure out, where do they start? What tips can you give people?
I've got a tip. People won't engage with you and start listening until they feel like they've been heard and that their perspective has been acknowledged. So that's the only door out of that room. You need to, if people are going to really engage, you need to engage with them first, listen to them and acknowledge their perspective. That's the number one task, I'd say, if you're helping your team through change.
I've got one, which is a team is a team, but it's also a set of individuals. And I think I'm more and more struck by the fact that don't, when you're trying to help the team, assume that everybody in the team is going through the same kind of process in their own individual journey, because they won't be.
Okay. We've still got a couple of minutes left. Any other thoughts? Any other questions from people? I've got so many things I want to ask, but now's not like we can get into it, and we'll never get out of it. I really want to hear the stories from, especially what you're doing with Public Health England and how that's gone and what you've actually been doing.
Well, the good news is we've had it evaluated, and we've got a 16% uplift in team leaders' confidence about their ability to handle a change. So for us, that's job done, because that's what we were supposed to do. But it's immensely traumatic. They were vilified in the press. So it's very difficult for them to feel that they can honor their previous contribution, which has been massive, even if mistakes were made. So there's all of that stuff. It's been really interesting. And actually, we've thoroughly found it really rewarding to work with them.
So over on the right, I have added contact details for David and Oscar and myself on LinkedIn. There's also the link to the CTO Craft conference that's happening, 4 days of talks and discussions and chats like this one on the 8th to the 11th of November. I've also there added a link to the CTO Craft community. And from there, if you scroll down, you can look at even just the free memberships gives you access to the Slack community. So have a look at that too. And hopefully be able to get Oscar and David on there too and can carry on the conversation, because I'm sure there's lots of other things. Any final thoughts, David, Oscar, anything to add?
No, not really, but we're always delighted to, so on the Slack channel or whatever, delighted to chip in what we think. If people want to throw up situations they're facing, it's what we enjoy doing.
Yeah, if you want to, if people are on the thing thinking I would actually really value just a conversation about this stuff, we're very happy to do that. We like that kind of informal reaching out, so do get in touch if you'd like to.
Excellent. The contact details are up there. Do reach out. Really, really interesting. Thanks very much, everybody, and I will end the broadcast there. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.